We all think we know what life in a royal palace looks like. It's a world of fairy tales, right? Opulent balls, devoted butlers, and cheerful maids, all serving a kindly king and queen. We see the gleaming carriages and the perfect gardens, and we imagine a life of dignified, quiet loyalty. But what if I told you that for the hundreds of servants who kept this machine running, the reality wasn't a fairy tale at all? It was a grueling 16-hour workday, a world riddled with disease, and the constant nagging fear of royal displeasure. This is the story of the lives you were never meant to see, the real story of what life was like for a palace servant. To be a servant in a royal palace was to live a life of jarring contrasts. You were surrounded by unimaginable luxury, but you owned almost nothing. You lived inside a magnificent home, but were stuck in its darkest, coldest corners. And you dedicated your entire life to the comfort of others, while getting very little in return. For most, getting into this world wasn't a choice born of ambition, but of sheer necessity. In an era with no social safety net, service was one of the few ways to survive. Families sent their children, some as young as 10, to the great houses and palaces. They hoped to secure a roof over their heads and food in their bellies, a much better fate than a factory or a workhouse. One former footman, hired at just 18, described arriving at Buckingham Palace as a nerve-wracking experience. His first room was a world away from the luxury outside. It was stark, with just a bed, a wardrobe, and a sink. The first shock for any new servant was the sheer amount of work. The day began long before the sun rose, usually around 5 or 6 a.m. The first tasks were the most brutal. In the biting cold of a pre-dawn palace, young housemaids had to rake out the old ashes from dozens of fireplaces and relay them with fresh coal and wood. They hauled massive jugs of hot water, heated in distant kitchens, up countless flights of stairs just so the family could wash. This was back-breaking work, and it was repeated all day long. Workdays stretched for 16 hours or more, often adding up to over 100 hours a week. If they were lucky, they might get one half-day off. There were no weekends and no holidays, only the endless ringing of service bells, a sound that dictated their every move. A footman's morning alone was a frantic rush of opening shutters, brushing his master's clothes, cleaning boots, trimming every oil lamp, and then finally laying the table for breakfast. And while the royals dined on lavish feasts, the servants got the leftovers or meager rations of bread, cheese, and beer. Their meals were basic, repetitive, and eaten quickly in the servants' hall. This relentless work was done under the constant threat of disease. Historic palaces weren't the sterile environments we see today. They could be filthy. Hallways were often black with soot, and with so many people, a deep clean was almost impossible. Royal bedding might only be changed a few times a year, becoming infested with lice and bed bugs. It was the servants who had to handle these linens and empty chamber pots full of waste, exposing them to infections and parasites. The laundry staff faced horrific conditions, dealing with soiled clothes that could fester for weeks, leading to rashes and sickness, all of which had to be handled without a single complaint. While some servants had long careers, for many, a serious illness could be a death sentence if it meant they could no longer work. Their living quarters offered little comfort. Servants were housed in the attics and basements, the parts of the palace the family never saw. These rooms were cramped, poorly ventilated, and freezing in the winter. Junior servants often slept in shared dormitories on basic beds stuffed with straw. A fire for warmth was a luxury for senior staff. It was a gilded cage, a life spent surrounded by splendor they could never touch. They were meant to be invisible, their world confined to a maze of hidden staircases and secret corridors, all designed to keep them out of sight. At the very bottom were the scullery maids and hall boys. As the youngest and newest, their lives were a cycle of the dirtiest jobs imaginable. A scullery maid spent her entire day with her hands plunged in greasy water, scrubbing pots until her skin was raw. She was the last to go to bed and the first to rise, rarely ever seeing daylight. A hall boy was a general dog's body, running errands, carrying coal, and doing any menial task someone demanded of him. For them, being invisible was a job requirement. They weren't to speak unless spoken to, and were expected to literally melt into the shadows if a royal passed by. One step up were the housemaids and footmen. A housemaid's work was still grueling, endless dusting and polishing, but she had her own domain, like a specific set of rooms. For a young man, becoming a footman was a big deal. Footmen were often chosen for their height and good looks because their main job was to be seen. Dressed in fancy livery, they were living symbols of the family's wealth. Their duties included serving at meals, answering the door, and accompanying the lady of the house on trips. Still, it was a life of exhausting servitude. The world below stairs was split into male and female domains. The women were ruled by the housekeeper. She was a figure of immense authority, often a stern woman who managed all the female staff. She held the keys to storerooms, was responsible for the house's cleanliness, and could hire and fire maids on a whim. Her male counterpart was the butler, the most senior servant in the house. The butler managed all the male staff, was in charge of the priceless silver and the wine cellar, and oversaw the general running of the household. Getting on the good side of the housekeeper or butler was critical. Crossing them was a very, very bad idea. At the very top of the pyramid were those who had direct personal contact with the royals, the lady's maid and the valet. They were more than just servants. They were personal attendants. A lady's maid was a skilled hairdresser, seamstress, and confidant who helped her mistress dress and care for her jewels. A valet was the gentleman's gentleman. He shaved his master, managed his wardrobe, and knew all his secrets. These roles were a bridge between the two worlds. They enjoyed privileges the lower servants couldn't dream of, but this closeness to power was a double-edged sword. This whole system was a hotbed of politics. There was constant rivalry for promotions and for the favor of senior staff. Gossip was currency, and petty jealousies could make life a nightmare. In one case, a servant favored by his master would deliberately sabotage others, shaking leaves onto a freshly swept path just to get them in trouble. To survive, you didn't just have to work hard. You had to understand the brutal power dynamics of life below stairs. For most palace servants, the goal was simple: be invisible. Palaces were built with this in mind, full of hidden corridors and back stairs that let staff move around without being seen. They were the silent, unseen army. To be noticed was usually a bad thing. A dropped plate or a misplaced teacup could lead to a public scolding, docked wages, or even instant dismissal. Being thrown out of the palace meant not just losing your job, but social ruin. A former housemaid, Jeanette Husky, who served in the 1980s, recalled finding herself alone in Queen Elizabeth's bedroom. She was so terrified of being accused of prying that she did her task and ran, admitting, "I have no idea what was in there." Her fear was a modern echo of a centuries-old rule. The safest path was to see nothing, hear nothing, and say nothing. Confidentiality was everything. And yet, for a select few, getting close to the royals wasn't a danger. It was a source of incredible power. Consider the role of the wet nurse. Tasked with feeding a royal baby, she formed one of the earliest bonds with a future monarch. These women were often well paid and could remain attached to the court for life. Then there was the groom of the stool. It sounds strange, but this was a real and powerful position. Originally, his job was to assist the king at the toilet, but the role evolved into one of supreme confidence. The groom of the stool was with the king at his most vulnerable moments. He became a de facto private secretary, controlling who got to see the monarch and handling his personal finances. He had the king's ear, making him one of the most influential men in the kingdom. But no story shows the risks and rewards of proximity better than that of John Brown, Queen Victoria's Highland servant. After her husband, Prince Albert, died, Victoria fell into a deep grief. She found comfort in the company of John Brown, a plain-speaking gillie from her Balmoral estate. He had started out leading the Queen's pony and was known for being honest and hard-working. Their relationship was like no other. He was famously blunt with the Queen, which she seemed to find refreshing. He was fiercely protective and once saved her from an attacker. Victoria, in turn, showered him with gifts and honors. Their closeness scandalized the court and her own children, who hated Brown's influence. Rumors flew that they were lovers, maybe even secretly married. While historians doubt these claims, their deep bond is undeniable. When Brown died, a heartbroken Victoria wrote of their strong and true an attachment, so warm and loving a friendship between the sovereign and servant. When she died, she was buried with a lock of his hair, a photo of him, and a ring he had given her. John Brown's story is the ultimate example of the double-edged sword. His closeness to the Queen gave him immense power, but it also made him a target of gossip and hatred. He was a servant who transcended his station, a friend who broke every rule, and his true relationship with the monarch is still a source of fascination today. Beneath the starched uniforms and strict rules, palace servants were, of course, just people. They found ways to build lives for themselves, finding moments of joy and friendship in a system designed to crush their individuality. Their main sanctuary was the servants' hall. Here, away from the prying eyes of their employers, the strict hierarchy softened a bit. It was where they could share a meal, play cards, and most importantly, talk. Gossip was the lifeblood of the downstairs world, a way to share news, vent frustrations, and feel a sense of community. The friendships formed here were a vital lifeline. Servants developed little tricks to cope. Some carried scented herbs to mask the foul odors of the palace. A riskier coping mechanism was the system of perquisites, or veils, unofficial job benefits. This could be the cook selling off extra kitchen fat or footmen keeping leftover candle ends. It was technically theft, but it was often overlooked as a way to supplement their tiny wages. Finding love in the palace was a dangerous game. Most households banned relationships between staff. A housemaid and footman caught courting could both be fired on the spot, but love still found a way, in secret courtships and stolen moments. For the few who were allowed to marry, it usually meant the wife had to leave service. The dream for many wasn't to climb the ladder of service, but to save enough money to finally leave it, to start a small business, raise a family, or just be independent. But the fears were much more immediate than the hopes. The biggest fear was dismissal. Losing your position meant losing your income, food, and shelter all at once. Illness was another constant dread. A servant who couldn't work was of no use. While some kind employers might care for a loyal servant, many were simply cast out. This led to the ultimate terror that haunted the servant class: the workhouse. This was the grim destination for the poor, the unemployed, and the sick. Families were separated and forced into hard labor just for a roof and a meal. The fear of ending up in a workhouse kept many servants locked in their jobs, enduring the hardship rather than risking the even harsher world outside. Their lives weren't fairy tales. They were stories of incredible hardship and limited freedom. But they were also stories of resilience, community, and the quiet, determined hope for a better life. So the next time you see a portrait of a monarch or a picture of a grand palace, remember the hundreds of forgotten souls who lived and worked within those walls. They weren't just background characters. They were the unsung pillars of the monarchy, and their lives are a powerful reminder of the human cost of keeping the crown glittering.